Hey,
Hello,
oh,
welcome back
so
to us.
I'm so excited to be back. It was a whole week of no Ukrainian spaces almost. It was a lot.
Yes, we were really, missing you. Although we had two really great shows and two fantastic Ukrainians Wednesday and Friday, but of course it's nothing without you. So welcome back,
Thank
and
you.
hope you've sorted out everything that you needed to sort out, and everything is back to, well, I cannot say normal, but everything is back to the place where you can co-host again, which is
Yes,
nice.
I'm definitely back and definitely ready to co-host with more awesome Ukrainians. So
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I mean, it hasn't. It's quite a hellish week, and the previous week was also quite hellish. But unfortunately, we learned yesterday very saddening news about one of our part of our Ukrainian Spaces family, Mariam Nayam, and her brother, who got really seriously injured in the east. So Mariam was public about it on social media and Twitter, and
yeah,
she shared this news. And I just want to quote something that she posted yesterday on Twitter, saying all this social media work, writing each thread and tweet to explain Ukraine to foreigners, it's exhausting. Why do I keep doing this? I'm selfish. I wanted to do everything I could to help my brother's safety. Today he was wounded, and I want to scream at this injustice. And of course, it's hard to read this because, unfortunately, with an intensifying fighting in the East, there are more and more people we know who got injured, who unfortunately got killed. And what Mariam is saying is something that really hit me yesterday as well, reminding
yeah,
me why we're doing this every day. Because those people on the front line also rely on us to keep speaking up, to make sure that every and single foreigner do not forget about this genocide happening,
yeah.
not for a single second.
But I think what you sent me yesterday was also really good as a reminder that all of our family and friends and people basically who are protecting us and protecting our land are partially also doing it for us, the people who are close to them. And so it's super important for us to keep going and keep doing what we're doing, because at the end of the day, a lot of our loved ones who are in tricky situations are really in need of us in terms of continuing.
Yeah, and I wanted, before we continue with our featured Ukrainian, I also wanted to remind everyone that today is a day of journalists in Ukraine, something we celebrate every year. And I always say that Ukrainian journalists are one of the most kick-ass, defined, fantastic people, at least in Europe, for sure. But I shared today the full list of journalists who were murdered during this genocide in Ukraine, my colleagues. And while I was putting it together, even for me, I know this number of 32, but even for me, the list was a bit overwhelmingly long. And I really want you guys to check out this list and to share it in honor of all those people and learn their names and say them with us as well. It was Roman Zhuk and Vitaly Derech and Konstantin Kitz, Oksana Haidar, Maxim Medinsky, Natalia Harakos, Alexander Mahov, Vera Herech, Zoroslav Zamoyski, Roman Nezheboretz, Yevhen Bal, Denis Kotenko, Serhiy Zaykovsky, Yuri Olinik, Lilia Humainova, Oleg Yakunin, Viktor Dedov, Pavlo Lee, Viktor Dudar, Serhiy Pushenko, Dilerbek Shakirov, Max Levin, Alexandra Kovshenova, Evhen Sakun. Okay, so let's for those who join us for the first time, let's maybe reminding them what Ukrainian Spaces is and what we're doing here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. I miss doing this. It feels like going back, as you said, to not normal, but to what we have been doing for the past 100 plus days. But essentially, the reason that we've been doing this with Maksym for quite a while now, we did a roundup post the other day of all the episodes that we've done. I think we've done now more than 20 plus live spaces, and I think over 10 episodes of the podcast on Apple and Spotify. But essentially, we were seeing millions of Ukrainians with perfect English sharing stories across social media platforms. But the conversations about Ukraine continue to be were and continue to be dominated by Western, mostly white and mostly male folks. And this not only continuously robs Ukrainians of our agency, but it also perpetuates outdated, misleading, false narratives about our country. So what we're doing here and today with our wonderful Ukrainian featured Ukrainian, we are fostering a relaxed, safe, and chill space for all of us to express our views and for those who are joining who are not Ukrainian to learn a bit more about our perspectives and views on our country and everything else as well.
And the last thing, the most important one though, is our patrons page. You can become our sponsor because Ukrainian Spaces still to the date is 100% independent, volunteer, and listener supported effort. And we're keep doing that only because of our growing number of sponsors. But we also need a bit of more help to make sure that we have the capacity to keep doing that, but also elevate the production a bit. And that's where you come in with your donation. So thank you so much. But also, this is not a charity. As our sponsor, you get cool stuff, extra stuff on Patreon Space. But most importantly, you get the front seat during our broadcasts. You can ask your questions to our featured Ukrainians in person or leaving them on our Patreon page. Please do that. And once again, thank you so much, guys, for existing and supporting us and making sure the Ukrainian voices are amplified. Yeah, so now we would love, and we're super excited to introduce our featured Ukrainian this time. It's Bohdana Neborak. She's with us. Bohdana, are you with us?
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, hey. So thank you so much for joining us. We have one ground rule: we never change. Every Ukrainian coming on Ukrainian Spaces has the power to introduce themselves absolutely the way they wanted it. And so please, can you share a bit of a story about yourself, who you are, where you come from, and what your life has been since the genocide started?
Okay. So hello everybody who's today with us. My name is Bohdana Neborak, and I'm Ukrainian journalist and culture manager. I was Ukrainian journalist and culture manager before February 24, and I'm lucky to keep my position and to work with the same things since the genocide started. And I need to say that I even feel that my work became much important since then. I love working with Ukrainian culture and with Ukrainian literature, and when I do anything, when I speak to anybody in my daily work at the Ukrainians, where I make interviews and where I'm the editor of the interviews, I always think and speak about culture in very broad and general terms. But I also like reading. I'm an avid reader, and I had a podcast about literature and how it influences our daily life. I'm a lawyer. I studied law at university at Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and I really wanted to become a human rights lawyer, but then I felt that I'm more useful as a person who works with culture and journalism. There is also that legal approach in my daily work, because I just can't be without that. And if speaking very briefly, that's it.
I feel like extremely privileged, especially as a Ukrainian, because I have this privilege of listening to your amazing, sensational podcast on Ukrainian literature in Ukrainian, which is called Bez Nazwy. So you guys, if there are Ukrainians here who are not aware of this podcast, this is absolute must. But also, if you're one of those lucky foreigners who understand Ukrainian, please do check it out. And for everyone else, I always kind of, to understand my just fascination with Bohdana's work, is her really fantastic and fresh and really refreshing look on the Ukrainian culture, not only because this is something that not usually being featured abroad very much, but also because she looks at it through decolonial lenses as well, and answers the questions like why there are so many foreigners abroad that have no idea about Ukrainian culture despite of its massive impact and very ancient history. So, I mean, Bohdana, I know that it's a bit loaded question, but when you faced with some of the foreigners time to time who have no idea, or what worse, when you mentioned that you're Ukrainian, they, you know, mentioning some Russian culture to you, what is your usual kind of a comeback to it? Like, how do you make sure that foreigners have really clear idea why Ukrainian culture hasn't been so widely popular among the foreigners in recent decades?
When I start this conversation with a person which doesn't work professionally in the field of culture or in the field of media, I'm usually trying to be nice and find some general points that might be known by this person. For example, the music of Daha Braha, or I don't know, the prose or poetry of Serhiy Zhadan or Andrei Kurkov, who are the best known Ukrainian writers abroad. And then a person might understand that he or she knows something from Ukrainian culture or Ukrainian literature. But if this conversation is professional, of course, I'm trying to use the decolonial lenses, because usually, unfortunately, we might hear that Ukrainian culture wasn't well known because it somehow didn't deserve it. Of course, it is not the issue, but the answer to this question is not that simple, and the answer is in the history of Ukraine. And it is important to introduce a brief history of Ukraine and the oppression of Russian Empire and then the USSR against Ukraine to make it clear why Ukrainian culture wasn't well known abroad. And it is not only Ukrainian culture. We speak about really a lot of different big and small cultures that were oppressed by Russia in recent hundreds of years. So I just try to depict at least the history of the last century, because Ukraine in the 20th century found itself in a state of double marginalization, and people really don't understand that there was a nation state which was destroyed by Russia in 1921, and that it led to the fact that there were no powerful, for example, foreign missions of Ukraine, or no authoritative lobbies abroad. And then when we come to the Ukraine's independence in 1991, it is also the difficult issue because, for example, there were a lot of university departments of Soviet studies abroad, and they mostly became the departments of post-Soviet studies or departments of Russian and East European studies. And when we come to the curriculums of those departments, we see that Russia is in the center of everything, and there might, some rules.
99%. Yeah, they call it post-Soviet, but in most cases that means just Russian right away.
And it is just difficult to understand to many people, because they think that, okay, there is a big state, it is called Ukraine, and it has 40 million people, but if we don't know any poet from this state, maybe there is no worth reading poet from this state, because they, for example, don't have a Nobel Prize winner. And it is a thing that deals with national complexes. And I mean, not only Ukrainian national complexes, but the national complexes of different European countries, for example, because they must admit that they don't know enough about this big country, and they must discover it.
Yeah. That's super interesting, and I think something Maksym spoke about earlier as well. But I know this will sound like a shortcut, and obviously the long sort of proper way to do this would be to read certain writers and poets, and we can pin your tweet as well that you did recently of Ukrainian writers and poets in English. But I was just wondering, and I don't know if this will be too open-ended of a question, but we talk a lot about misconceptions that the West has about Ukraine. And to me, it seems like the logical way to deal with some of those misconceptions is to read Ukrainian poets and Ukrainian literature from over the ages. But I was just wondering, what, in your opinion, do you think would be what would you learn if you were a Westerner and you read some of those books that you've been recommending, or in general Ukrainian literature from over the years? What do you think would be like sort of the biggest things that you would learn that you might not necessarily already know as a Westerner?
I think it is really a very broad story, because on the one hand, you may start, for example, with the history of Ukrainian executive renaissance. It is the very bright generation of Ukrainian modernists and avant-garde writers, and it is just very interesting. On the other hand, you might start with the generation that came after Chernobyl, when there was perestroika in the USSR, and a lot of Ukrainian writers were able to write with bigger freedom. Also, you might start with Ukrainian writers from the late 19th and early 20th century, because those writers are very important for Ukrainian nation building process, as anywhere in Europe. I mean, those processes of Romantism, when the nation states were founded and the ideas and narratives of nation states were constructed. So I think there are a lot of untold stories from Ukrainian literature. But if I may advise our audience to start with something, I of course advise to start with the contemporary Ukrainian writers, because those are the people who live in the world we live in, and they comment on the situations we are all in. And also you might just turn on the YouTube video and watch them and listen to them. And for example, Serhiy Zhadan is a really great example, because he is not only a rock star from Ukrainian poetry, but also prose. He is a person which stays in Kharkiv from the first day of war. In his recent interview, he told that war came to him when he, with his team, was on their road to their concert. And of course, they decided to come back to Kharkiv because they understood they want to protect their city and not to become the refugees who lost their country. And there were very difficult and very tough times when I know a lot of people were writing to Serhiy Zhadan and told him that he must save himself because he is a very important voice of contemporary Ukraine. But he decided to stay in Kharkiv and to protect the country. And I think that his decisions make his literature even more powerful, and it is just something you can feel now, because it is the history that is made just behind us.
Actually, I think you are the best person to ask this question, because one of the debates, or one of the comebacks from a lot of foreigners I always get is, please, can you name specific examples how specifically Russia is colonial to Ukraine? And just recently, you tweeted about the story that is now in the news, how in occupied Mariupol, Russians are bringing Russian teachers who force onto Ukrainian kids who are still there Russian language, Russian literature. They ban Ukrainian literature from curriculum. They ban Ukrainian language as a language of teaching. But if you would take a bit longer perspective, can you maybe explain us how exactly Russian colonial rule suppressed Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian culture through the decades?
Yeah, it's really a tough question, and the example that you give is just horrific. And when I saw that video, I cried, because I understood that it is a history from the 17th century, and it has been repeating with us each century and sometimes each decade. But still, it is something that Ukrainians really know. That when Russia comes to this territory, it tries to erase this culture and this language, and the history of oppression of Ukrainian language, and for example, the right to publish and to spread books and literature in Ukrainian is very long, and it really lasted for more than 400 years. And very interesting thing is that we have already 30 years of independence, but on the other hand, we have this 400 years of oppression. And these 400 years influence us till today. Because, for example, you had a really outstanding podcast about Lesya Ukrainka and Ukrainian modernism, and Lesya Ukrainka just wasn't able to publish her works in her home city or in Kiev. She had to publish it in Lviv, because Lviv was a part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was just legally okay there to publish something in Ukrainian. Oh, yeah. You started that with that story of Mariupol, and it's just difficult for me to go on. So probably try with another question.
I mean, it's great. It's a great example, and I think not only in that episode, which is also available as a podcast. So I think it's our second episode. We also talked a lot how through the centuries, Russian colonial rule would not only, this is the easiest example, how writers were squashed and forbidden. They couldn't publish anywhere. Or would be outright killed, sent to Siberia and whatnot. But there was also another way of influencing and rewriting and raising those voices by Russian colonial rule misrepresenting their writings. Like, you mentioned Lesya Ukrainka, that through decades and centuries afterwards, during the Russian colonial rule, was sold back to Ukrainians completely as this infantile, romanticized, childlike figure. And her work on feminism, on anti-colonial statements, on liberation, on Ukrainian independence, they were all squashed, and we didn't even knew much about it just because that's how she was represented, right?
Yeah, and it's also our heritage from Russia, because they understood that figures like Lesya Ukrainka or Taras Shevchenko or Ivan Franko, they are just too big and too huge. And there is the Museum of Lesya Ukrainka in Volyn region. And it is really interesting to come there, because when Soviets came to Volyn, they of course came to museum, and they understood that they just need to do something with Lesya Ukrainka and her house, and they just decided to dedicate one of the rooms to Marxism, to Lenin, and in this way to tighten Lesya Ukrainka to communist ideology. And that's what they did also with Ivan Franko, and I'm from Lviv. I grew up there, and there is something like cult of Ivan Franko. He is very important person from the for Lviv, and till today, people who work with Ivan Franko, with his museum, with his heritage, just need to solve that post-Soviet approach, which still is alive, and it is alive at our schools, at some of the museums, at excursions, and even in literature and in academia.
Bohdana, I also wanted to ask you about Shestidesiatniki a little bit more, and because I'm sure a lot of people don't in the West and just outside of Ukraine don't know too much about the well-known poets, journalists, activists, all part of this movement in Ukraine. It's actually something I knew probably very little about, sadly and unfortunately for me, before the war started, but I find it so fascinating, their stories, their lives, their fate. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, to tell everyone here a little bit about this movement and the literature and poetry that sort of started from that.
Yeah, of course. It is the generation of Ukrainian dissidents, and it is very interesting to think about them, because it was the new generation that decided to step aside from a communist ideology after the executed Renaissance. So some decades passed, the new people grew up, and then found out that there is something bad with their country and with the Soviet Union. But there are some things that I find very interesting about dissidents, and first of all is that a lot of dissidents, of a lot of Ukrainian writers, dissidents, they were from Donbas region. For example, Vasyl Stus or Ivan Svetlichny. Maybe the best example is Vasyl Stus, because he was murdered in Soviet camps in the late 80s. And there are a lot of people who think that the Soviet Union in late 80s was something very democratic and a good place to live in, but totally not for Ukrainian writers who just wanted to write in Ukrainian and to tell what they think. And I really like that Vasyl Stus is among those people who are from Eastern Ukraine, because it gives us an image of a person from Eastern Ukraine. We also spoke today about Serhiy Zhadan, who is also a great character of Ukrainian East, but Vasyl Stus was the same. But if speaking about Ukrainian dissidents, most of them were also Ukrainian modernist writers, and they were not writing the rival poetry or the especially nationalistic poetry. Let me tell you my personal story. My godfather is Ihor Kolonets, and he is a Ukrainian modernist writer from 60s. And he and his wife Irina Kolonets were sentenced to 6 years of labor camps and 3 years of living in the deep east of Russia. And they wanted to write in Ukrainian, and they wanted to protect human rights in Soviet Union. But that was enough to get sentenced. And when you read the poetry of Ihor Kolonets before this sentence, you just understand it is a very deep and very special modernist poetry. He was called a prince of Ukrainian poetry. He was well known, for example, for finding a grave of Bohdan Igor Antonich, who was a poet from Lviv who was just forgotten by the Soviet Union, and his grave was demolished. But of course, the position of USSR influenced him and his circle and his wife, and he moved on with writing in camps. And when he came back from Russia and from his imprisonment, of course, he called himself a Ukrainian patriot, and he went on in fighting for Ukrainian independence. And it is interesting that Russian Empire is that power that makes Ukrainian poets fighters for Ukrainian independence, because it is enough just to write in Ukrainian.
Yeah, enough just be existing, and it's already kind of an act. Manifesting your Ukrainians is already an act of anti-colonial struggle. And thank you so much for mentioning Donbass in the East. I think we sometimes remind people that there's so many very passionate anti-colonial figures fighting, who fought and who are still fighting against Russian colonialism from Eastern Ukraine, just for the simple fact that it suffered from Russian colonialism like probably no other region in Ukraine, and the damage it did to that region in terms of not only cultural but also human impact with genocide is probably horrible. But I wanted to, ask a quick follow-up on the Russian dissident wave of 60s and Ukrainian dissident wave of 60s, because abroad people often know names of Russian dissidents like Solzhenitsyn or Yevtushenko, and they're celebrated, and they've been celebrated for decades. Despite that, for example, for everyone in Ukraine, it's well known that those people were reproducing colonial and imperialistic narratives about Russia, and some of them used in their work very derogatory terms about Ukraine. But how do you explain even this dynamic lack of awareness between the same generation of the same dissidents that lived formally in the same country at the same time, but when it comes to Ukrainian dissidents, their names are almost not known abroad, and Russian dissidents, despite their colonial and imperialistic views, are still celebrated? Doesn't really makes you frustrated as well?
Yeah, there are a couple questions here. First of all, we usually mix dissidents and people from the 60s because there were people who were really dissidents. I mean, they somehow fought the Soviet Union, and also there are people like Yevtushenko who felt well in the Soviet Union or Voznesenskiy. But once I have asked my godfather Ihor Kolonets about that, and how did they communicate with dissidents from Russia, and he told me that in camps they all communicated well. and they shared some literature, they shared ideas, they discussed a lot. It is a very tough thing for me today that I feel that contemporary Russia doesn't have that heritage of the Russian dissidents like, for example, Sakharov. But you mentioned Solzhenitsyn, and he is a very important figure to discuss and to dwell upon because Solzhenitsyn knew well what Gulag was. And for example, Solzhenitsyn was that very person that mentioned that when people from Ukraine came to Gulag, they made it to fall apart because people from the people from Ukrainian nationalists were really good in fighting against Russian Empire. But when Solzhenitsyn came from Gulag and wrote his famous Archipelago Gulag, and when he got his Nobel Prize, he still was a person who admired the idea of Russian Empire or of Soviet Empire because it is just the same. And for me, it is the most tragic issue that Solzhenitsyn, who understood what Russian Empire is, was against the independence of Ukraine and all other oppressed national states. And he just worked for this empire. And that's why today's Russia remembers Solzhenitsyn, but doesn't remember Sakharov.
Even myself, I grew up abroad for a really long time. And for me, as you were saying, like, you know, I was taught that Solzhenitsyn was like the cool anti-everything, anti sort of authoritarian writer and things like that. But I think it's so important what you're saying and what you're educating everyone else in relation to where he came. You know, we've been saying this for a while. A lot of the time as soon as it comes to the question of Ukraine and Ukraine's freedom and independence, a lot of these figures start crumbling. But I was just wondering if you had any other examples of other writers or poets that we should perhaps, question a little bit more their literature, because it's all about also a critical view from our perspective now.
I would just quickly add that maybe in practical terms, I always, because I'm not a huge expert on literature, but when people keep naming me some really famous Russian cultural figures, I always encourage them to match it with something from Ukraine. Like, if you spend them some time learning the names and learning the cultural imprint of some Russians, and you claim to be Ukrainian ally, you must do the same work on Ukraine. And if you know a famous Russian writer, then check yourself if you know a famous Ukrainian writer. If you know a famous, someone, a composer or whatever, check yourself if you know the same from Ukraine. I think in this simple terms, that could be a very powerful decolonizing moment for our allies to go through, right?
100%, and totally agree with you. I'm the person who usually says, we should be spending our time on talking about Ukraine and not talking about other places, but that's a great way of framing it as well.
I just want to add that it is not about bad or good Russian culture or Russian literature, but it is a question of justice and injustice. And Ukrainian culture, as well as many Eastern European cultures, they were just not given enough light because all that light was given to Russia. I don't want to cancel Russia at all, because it is just not possible. But what I dream about is to see Russian literature to be reread, and to be reread with a decolonial and post-colonial point of view. And I want justice to be served to Eastern Europe, and some of the positions will definitely be changed or be switched because, for example, there are a lot of Polish writers who deserve much more attention, and also there are a lot of Czech writers who deserve much more attention than they have today. And of course, there are a lot of Ukrainian writers and texts that must be translated. And usually when people speak about the so-called big Russian literature or big Russian culture, they don't ask themselves, why do they know these names? Why do they know these texts? And the answer is very simple, because Russia invested a lot of money to make this culture known worldwide. Of course, there are good texts. Of course, there is powerful music. Of course, there is word culture like in any other nation state in the world. But when you give this culture enough money and enough marketing, of course, it becomes much visible. And the problem is that Russian culture became much more visible, making another culture not less visible, but like invisible. And it is a very big injustice that a lot of people across the world were pretending to be blind to it.
When I was growing up, before the renaissance of Ukrainian publishing that happened, maybe in the last just 15 years, in the 90s, it wasn't possible to find a Ukrainian book just because Russian publishing already after the fall of the Soviet Union had a head start in terms of industry. It was much richer, it was much better developed, and they just flooded Ukraine with Russian published books, and it was really hard to find a Ukrainian one. So I think it's a very powerful, example that also kind of illustrates how it works in terms of economy of colonization. Bohdana, I wanted to, sorry if you have
I just wanted to add that they just had a very good distribution, and even until the Revolution of Dignity, I used to see people that were buying, for example, the translations that were made from foreign language into Russian, not into Ukrainian, because they were used to it and they thought that Russian might be better. It's not like that, but it is a very big stereotype that worked, of course, also with Ukrainians here inside the country.
Yeah. And it's a question to Western publishers as well. For example, if you go to any bookstore, of course, these days the Ukrainian or Ukrainian-themed books are presented in the front. But before the genocide, you would go to a store and it would be very hard to find any Ukrainian books. And just comparatively speaking, Russia is a population of 140 million and Ukraine is 40 million. So in that proportion, okay, you can find 3 books Russian, but at least 1 Ukrainian. But it's never the case. And, partially because some publishers in the West also need to ask themselves why translations of Ukrainian writers aren't commissioned to the date. And for example, even for myself, it was very hard to find a publisher for my first book that hopefully will be, released soon, just because there are no connection. People do not work with Ukrainian authors at all, and for some publishers, it's unheard to be a publisher of Ukrainian author in the first place. So this is still a long road to go. Bohdana, we will have to wrap up, but I have a very important question I wanted to ask you also about eternal decolonization problem. and process? Because I know on your podcast, you also discuss that it's not only important to educate the rest of the world about the Russian colonial legacy and how it impacted Ukrainians, but also for Ukrainians to go through this process of developing awareness, how our lives and our culture and our literature have been shaped by Russian colonial rule. And I know that you discussed this very a great example how still to the date, a lot of Ukrainian authors or just regular Ukrainians get kind of excited when they hear news about Russian prominent people supporting Ukraine. And I know that you always have very powerful things to say about that this shouldn't be, that Ukrainians should question themselves why they think that just a extension of human solidarity is so celebrated when it comes to Russians, when in fact should be totally normal, shouldn't be really paying attention to that, because that's how things should be in general.
Thanks a lot for this take. When we started our podcast, we wanted, with my friend Nastya, who is also a culture manager and who works with big festivals and fairs in Ukraine and abroad. We just wanted to make a podcast which will be accessible for everybody. We just wanted to show that culture and Ukrainian culture is not something only highbrow. Because that's the thing about culture in Ukraine. It's because we are a colonial state. That when somebody was, for example, translating something or researching something in Ukraine, that person was trying to make, something like a PhD from that, because people like Lesa Ukrainka or people like Ukrainian dissidents understood that there might be no other person who will do that work after them. And it really makes a very difficult approach to culture at all in Ukraine, because a lot of people just feel that it is something very, very difficult. We wanted to show that it is something that may give you not only joy and fun, but also to help you discover something about yourself. But there is also another thing, and it is about Russian culture, which, of course, was present in Ukraine, and it is still present. And I need to say that it will be present because it is the culture of our enemies, but also of our neighbors. I want to say that Russian culture is imperial culture, and it means that it tempts. It is very special about the energy of this culture, but I think that it explains a lot why this culture is very famous also abroad, not only in Ukraine, but also why it is well known here and accepted here in Ukraine. And in this podcast, we just want to raise all those questions about colonialism, but also self-decolonization, and not to make this conversation I'm a person who is Ukrainian speaking from my birth, and I don't have issues with language, I don't have issues with culture, but I understand that I'm rather an exception in this way, but also I want to find a way to speak to all those people who, for example, want to switch a language or just want to discover something deeper and want to discover their culture more. And what is important to me, I want people who listen to our podcast to associate themselves with Ukrainian culture and to feel that culture not a phenomena, but culture which is tightened, for example, with European culture, because Ukrainian culture, I believe, is that very source that helps us understand why we are together with European civilization, but not with Russian Empire. Why Russian Empire is aggressor? Because when we try just to cancel Russia and just to close our eyes to this culture and to those people and to try to forget them, I think that it is something very dangerous to us. But when we try to understand those connections between us and them, but also between us and other countries, us in Europe, us in United States, and so on, we just will be more powerful, and we will understand our identity better.
Oh my God, this is so powerful. Thank you so much. I mean, it actually also challenged my views on canceling Russia, because it makes literally more sense what you're saying in terms of understanding how exactly Russian culture is colonial and imperial, and how exactly it made sure that it's known worldwide at the expense of colonized cultures. But most importantly, and again, thank you so much for raising this issue of the conversations that we have back in Ukraine about our problems inflicted by colonial rule, like, for example, the inferiority complex that we have. And I think very often, I remember this powerful part in your podcast when you guys talked about the real triumph of colonialism in our lives is not through outright ban or genocide or killing or suppression, but when we ourselves start questioning whether we're worthy enough. And this is the main triumph of colonialism in Ukraine or with any other colonized nations or communities.
We always need to ask our final question that we ask everyone who has joined us in Ukrainian Spaces, which is a little bit about Ukrainian identity for each and every person individually. So, Bohdana, we would like to know, what do you think and what does it mean to be Ukrainian for you in particular?
I think that the main feature of being Ukrainian for me is being inclusive. Ukrainians speak different languages. Ukrainians go to different churches, or they might be atheists. They have different points of view, but they have the same values and they have the same political culture, and this culture is the same in Ukrainian East, but also in Ukrainian West, in Ukrainian Center, and in Ukrainian South. I live in Kyiv. I have been living here for already more than 6 years, and it became my home. I really love Kyiv because when I lived in Lviv, of course, I was like that cliche lady from Western Ukraine who knows a lot about history of Austro-Hungary and so on. But in Kyiv, I felt that my scope of people who I may meet is much broader than it was in Lviv. But nevertheless, if you come to Lviv, if you come to Kharkiv, if you come to Kyiv, to Chernihiv, to Zaporizhia, you will feel that Ukrainian is very diverse, but in the same time, it is very unique, and that's what I really love mostly here, and I think that it is the main characteristic.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, one thing that we definitely take from all of this that we need to have you on for more conversations, because this one is amazing and there's so much to unpack, and I feel like we just touched upon everything a little bit, and there's for each question there could be a separate episode easily. So thank you so much. It was fantastic to host you as featured Ukrainian this time around. And also, just quickly, if you want to bring any attention to maybe sources or platforms you want to amplify, or maybe even fundraisers, please do that. At the moment, you feel free to mention it.
I work for the Ukrainians media, and we have a membership program, and we live with the support of our readers. So, of course, if you want to support us, to support independent journalism, reportages, interviews, but also podcasts and media projects, you might support us, but also I think that you need to support Ukrainian spaces if you want to know more about Ukraine and Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian way of living in the broadest sense. But for now, just thank you guys. Thank you, Valeria and Maksym, for having me. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I think that's about it. I just wanted real quick, I know we ran out of time, but I really wanted to quick mention one of the comments that we got about the podcast and about the Ukrainian Spaces broadcast from one of our listeners. So I'm not going to mention the name because it was shared in private, but still. So here's what the person wrote to us. I felt like the podcast has been a good Ukrainian friend to me in the last 3 months, especially when non-Ukrainian friends just can't relate. With every new voice I hear and with every new thing I learn, I become more and more proud to be Ukrainian. There is a moment in every episode that stops me in my tracks and chokes me right up. In one episode, you talked about hating that Russia taught you to hate, and how that hate will be uprooted, that Russia cannot have that hate. I will never forget those words that stopped me in my tracks at the grocery store and brought me to tears. And honestly, I also cried over this. So thank you so much. These kind of feedbacks and messages, they're the kindest ever, and they help us to be motivated and keep working for Ukrainian spaces and for Ukrainians as well. So,
Absolutely.
okay, guys, this is it. Apart from one thing, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.
Okay, bye, everyone.